Señora Susan Martin, directora del Instituto de Estudios para la Migración Internacional de la Universidad de Georgetown. Señora Sherry Truss, secretaria ejecutiva para el desarrollo integral de la Organización de los Estados Americanos. Señoras y señores observadores permanentes y miembros de la comunidad diplomática, también quiero reconocer la presencia de un grupo de diputados del Paraguay que nos acompañan para esta Cátedra de las Américas. Quiero darles a todos y a todas la más cordial bienvenida a esta 52ª Cátedra de las Américas que hemos titulado La migración como factor positivo para el desarrollo de las Américas. Quiero agradecer la presencia del director general de la Organización Internacional para las Migraciones, señor William Lacy Swing, así como también de la directora del Instituto de Estudios para la Migración Internacional de la Universidad de Georgetown, señora Susan Martin, quienes nos honran con su presencia en esta cátedra que aborda un tema que cada vez cobra mayor importancia, ya que la migración internacional toca múltiples aspectos sociales, económicos, políticos, culturales y de derechos humanos, y lo hace tanto en los países emisores como en los países de tránsito, como también en los países de destino. Agradecemos también la presencia de nuestro secretario general, José Miguel Insulza, quien en breve nos dará unas palabras de bienvenida, las cuales serán seguidas por una presentación del embajador Lacy Swing, para luego tener comentarios por parte de la señora Martin. Acto seguido abriremos un espacio para preguntas o comentarios de la audiencia, que será moderado por la secretaria Truss, y luego concluiremos con unas palabras de clausura de la secretaria Truss, para luego pasar a una recepción que tenemos preparadas para ustedes en el patio Azteca, acá en el primer nivel. Quiero dar ahora la palabra al señor secretario general para sus palabras de bienvenida.
Muy buenos días, señores y señores embajadores, representantes permanentes y alternos de la OEA, Director General of the International Organization of Migration, William Lacy Swing, Director of the Institute of Studies of International Migration of Georgetown University, Susan Martin, estimadas personas presentes en esto, bienvenidos a la OEA. Bienvenidos a una nueva edición de la Cátedra de las Américas en esta Casa de las Américas. Quiero poner de relieve el título de esta reunión, que es la migración como factor positivo para el desarrollo de las Américas. Yo creo que este es un tema que no solamente engloba nuestra visión actual sobre secretario general adjunto, Albert Randin, directora del programa de migración, Marcia Bebiano, perdón, a veces olvido yo los vocativos correspondientes. Digo, hoy tiene una gran importancia, sin duda, pero siempre la ha tenido. Nosotros tenemos una historia de migración en este continente, como lo sabemos, que ha tenido varios ciclos. Primero, incluso hasta la primera mitad de esta década, los países del continente fueron destino para la migración transoceánica, especialmente de Europa y de África, para convertirse luego, con excepción de Estados Unidos y Canadá, en países de emigración. Alrededor de los 60 se inicia una migración permanente cada vez más intensa de América Latina y el Caribe hacia los países desarrollados, principalmente a Estados Unidos y Canadá. Y también hay, paralelamente y con posterioridad a eso, más recientemente, una emigración regional entre países vecinos, que es presente a través del tiempo y que tiene de magnitud que empieza siendo moderada y después pasa a ser mayor. Por ejemplo, se dice siempre, bueno, ciertamente, como lo voy a decir a continuación, Estados Unidos es la principal fuente del destino de migración, pero el segundo, contrariamente a lo que se dice, no es ningún país europeo, es la República Argentina. Costa Rica, Venezuela, República Dominicana, recientemente Chile, en proporción a sus números de habitantes, son importantes receptores de migrantes. Por lo tanto, este es un tema en ascenso en nuestra región, y probablemente la cifra más significativa de este ascenso es que América Latina y el Caribe son alrededor de un 8% del total mundial de población, y los migrantes de esa procedencia son un 16% del total de los migrantes del mundo. La mayor parte de ellos migran dentro de América. Su principal lugar de migración, por cierto, es Estados Unidos. Alrededor de 3/4 partes de los migrantes del resto de las Américas son migrantes de Estados Unidos. Y como digo, después está Argentina, Brasil, Canadá, Colombia, Costa Rica, México, República Dominicana, Venezuela, España. Y las corrientes migratorias entre países de América Latina son probablemente las más relevantes, generalmente a los países contiguos, a los que están más cercanos a ellos. A pesar de esta situación, la migración no tiene una atención, homogénea y políticas muy claras dentro de las Américas. Antes de ello, recuerdo que no solamente cuando hablo de importancia, no es solamente una importancia demográfica, también es una importancia económica. Los migrantes siguen siendo un apoyo crucial para millones de hogares de la región. Los flujos de remesa a América Latina y el Caribe desde América del Norte llegaron durante el año 2012 a 61.300 millones de dólares. Incremento importante de 300 millones con respecto al 2011. Es un fenómeno permanente. En la crisis, ciertamente las remesas disminuyeron, pero no disminuyó el número de remitentes. Es decir, en plena crisis la gente siguió mandando dinero, aunque en menores cantidades, desde este país hacia sus países en América Latina. Eso tiene una enorme importancia. Pero aún así, no hemos tenido una política homogénea, no hemos tenido un tratamiento homogéneo. Y recién, es importante decir que en esta misma organización, solamente desde el 2009, hay una comisión encargada de los temas migratorios, y también existe desde hace poco tiempo un programa sobre migración que ha remitido ya 2 informes sobre el tema de migración en las Américas. Hasta ahora estos temas, por lo tanto, este tema que es hemisférico por excelencia, no había sido hasta hace pocos años tratado en la Organización de Estados Americanos. Y por eso nos alegra mucho que esto haya cambiado. Tenemos una política distinta. Acá está el presidente de nuestra comisión de asuntos migratorios, el embajador Olivier Brutus de Haití. Y nos alegra mucho la presencia de todos ustedes aquí. La verdad es que este es un tema central para todos nosotros. Sabemos que en este mismo país se están discutiendo políticas migratorias que son cruciales para toda nuestra región. Creemos que este es un tema en el cual tenemos además una participación muy importante de la población latina y caribeña que habita en este país. Cuando se habla de América Latina hoy día con propiedad se puede casi incluir al país en que estamos en América Latina, en el sentido de que solo hay 2 países, Brasil y México. Solo hay 2 países en el mundo, que son Brasil y México, que tienen la magnitud de población latinoamericana que tiene este país. Y eso es realmente muy importante. Porque lo siguiente es un tema, como digo, muy importante, muy crucial para nosotros. La Organización Internacional para las Migraciones, que dirige nuestro querido amigo con gran experiencia también en la región, William Lacy Swing, que es una organización que lleva varios años trabajando en estos temas en los lugares más complejos del mundo. Es una organización cuya importancia crece precisamente allí donde hay más fenómenos de migración y donde hay más dificultades. No en vano ha abierto recientemente oficinas en algunos países que son precisamente lugares de poca seguridad y muchos problemas, sin embargo, de refugiados y de migración. Y nos alegra mucho entonces tenerlo con nosotros para hablar de este tema, de lo que su organización hace y del trabajo que realizamos conjuntamente, porque también la OIM es parte del Grupo Conjunto de Cumbres de las Américas y tenemos por lo tanto un trabajo permanente con ellos. Muy bienvenidos a todos y muchas gracias. Mejor seguir adelante. Gracias.
Es para mí un gran honor ofrecerle la palabra al embajador William Lacy Swing, un diplomático de gran experiencia, como ustedes podrán darse cuenta en la breve biografía, muy breve, que hemos puesto acá en el brochure de esta cátedra de las Américas. No lo voy a leer porque ustedes lo tienen y particularmente porque queremos utilizar más tiempo escuchándolo a él y a la señora Martin. Ambassador, would you like to speak?
He doesn't need that right
Would
now.
you like to speak from here?
Q&A, not now. Thank you. Bueno, tenemos preguntas y respuestas entonces.
Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues and participants, what an honor, what a joy to be with you this morning. I wish to underline the honor that I have in behalf of IOM to take part in this very distinguished OAS lecture series, and I'd like to thank you in particular, Mr. Secretary General, for giving me this unique opportunity to exchange with you and to hear your views on how together we can make migration a positive force in the Americas for development, or perhaps I should say a more positive force for development. It's already contributing a lot. I'm particularly grateful for the opportunity given, first of all, IOM's close cooperation with the OAS. I'd like to thank you, sir, for the Memorandum of Understanding we signed together in 2009. Thank you for the opportunity we have to participate in the Migration Affairs Committee that you have, the CAM, where we're working closely together to do a series of training for staff members of missions, consular officers, and the staff here at the OAS headquarters. It's also, we're glad for the opportunity because it also underlines the importance and the growing importance of migration in the Americas. And thirdly, it's very timely because of the second high-level dialogue on migration and development that will be held at the UN General Assembly this Thursday and Friday, October 3 and 4. So I want to make 3 points, and I would first of all like to try to set the scene for you by talking about global migration trends, and then transition quickly to talk about some of the trends in the Americas, which the Secretary General has already very eloquently addressed, and then finally to close on some prospects for the high-level dialogue that's taking place this week in New York. First of all, on the global migration trends, it's important to say that we are living in a world on the move. This is an era of unprecedented human mobility. There are more people on the move today than at any other time in recorded history. In the year 2010, the world population reached a total of 7 billion. So today, 1 in every 3 persons is in a migratory status. One in every 7 persons is a migrant, including my own family, who now live on 4 continents. That's more the norm than the exception these days. So migration is the 21st century's mega trend. There are 232 million international migrants, persons crossing an international boundary. This is up from 175 million in the year 2000 and 154 million in 1990. There are also 740 million domestic migrants who don't cross a border, who are turning in their own country seeking a better life. I was in China 2 weeks ago. Foreign minister told me that China alone has as many domestic migrants as there are globally international migrants, about 230 million. So we have to ask ourselves, what is driving this movement? Why are all these people moving? Well, first of all, it's clearly demography. We must remember that the 20th century was the first time in recorded history that the world's population quadrupled, fourfold. Never happened before. I can easily say it'll never happen again because I won't be around to be proved wrong. But that is driving this more and more today, and there were two other trends that came out of this period. One is the feminization of migration. Not that there weren't about 50% of the migrants women before, but these are women now who are qualitatively different in the sense that many of them are now not just going to join a family, but are pursuing careers. The second phenomenon coming out of the 20th century is that it's very much an urban movement now, the urbanization, the first time in the history that there are more people in cities than in the rural areas. This occurred also in 2010. Now, this large-scale movement, if we believe the demographers, is scheduled to continue until about mid-century, at which time our world will have about 9 billion inhabitants. It'll begin to taper off, but in this same period, there will be a great need for workers in most of the industrialized part of the world. So by 2040, there will be 400 million international migrants. And those jobs in the north to be filled are largely going to come from the global south. Now, labor demands are also then driving large-scale migration. Aging OECD countries and other developed countries will need tens of millions of workers that they will not have, given their negative replacement rate, whereby in most of their societies, more people are dying than being born. These are coming from the South, and this large influx will change the very nature and composition of the traditional 19th century nation state. But there is not a lot of political courage out there to prepare populations for what is inevitably going to happen, because migration does not generally win a lot of votes. The other drivers, digital revolution, year 2000, 300 million people connected to the internet. Today, it's 2 billion. If Mark Zuckerberg has his way, everybody will soon be connected. And so people have instant information. Distance shrinking technology, budget travel, the growing disparities between North and South economically and socially, the degradation of the environment and climate change, the growing number of complex, multiple disasters, both natural and human-made. The dreams, of course, are another driver. So all of these forces are going to ensure that large-scale migration will remain a mega trend of the 21st century. And already today, these international migrants comprise a population group larger than the population of Brazil and only slightly smaller than the population of Indonesia. My second point deals with migration in the Americas today. The Americas remain extremely important for international migration. The world's largest international migration corridor by far. We're all sitting on it, either here or wherever we are in this hemisphere. It is the corridor between South and Central America and Mexico on the one hand, and North America on the other hand. There are more than 57 million international migrants in this corridor, which constitutes about 27% of all international migrants. And increasingly, of course, this is becoming a north-south corridor as well, and a south-south corridor. And in our latest World Migration Report, where we deal with all quadrants of migration, you will see the trends are very clear. South-south migration is growing. It's at least as important as south-north migration. North-north migration is growing, and north-south migration is growing. So since 1990, the number of international migrants in the North American, South American corridor grew more than that of any other region in the world in absolute terms by about 25 million, the next closest being Europe with 23 million. People are increasingly aware of the growing importance of south-south migration, but north-south migration, a relatively new phenomenon, is rising. As we described it in our report on the well-being of migrants, a large proportion of the world's migrant workers continue to come from traditional low and mid-income immigration countries. However, increasing numbers of these workers are coming from high-income countries. They're drawn to low and mid-income destinations. That is increasing north-south migration. In Brazil alone, for example, there's been a 64% increase between 2009 and 2011 in work permits granted to foreigners, the largest single recipient group being U.S. nationals in 2011. So we've seen a large increase in the Latin America and Caribbean region in arrivals associated with the economic crisis, with top countries of origin coming to this area, being Spain with 48,000, Germany 21,000, Netherlands 17,000, and Italy 16,000. The impact of global migrant remittances is enormous. At 400 billion plus in 2012, projected to rise to 515 billion by 2015. Migrant remittances are several times larger than all total foreign assistance and roughly equivalent to the total of direct foreign investment. Where migrant remittances globally are calculated, if they were to be calculated as GDP, migrant GDP would be roughly equivalent to the GDP of Saudi Arabia. Several countries in the Americas, of course, depend heavily on remittances, but it would be misleading to limit our discussion to thinking about migrant remittances only in monetary terms. The real payoff comes when migrants can keep a foot in several camps, home country and host country, ability to move back and forth and to contribute to both, which is generally speaking what migrants want to do. But government policies simply have not caught up with the human mobility movement of our time. Social remittances, where we have, for example, talented people returning home from abroad, greatly benefit countries recovering from crises or expanding economically. We help facilitate such returns through a program we call Return of Qualified Nationals, RQN. I was just meeting in New York with the Somali president, and we have already returned 179 highly qualified Somalis to Mogadishu and other parts of Somalia, simply to make sure that there is capacity there to do the work that has to be done. We've assisted nearly 4,000 diaspora in this respect. There's a perception of migration that is changing today, fortunately, from one of a taboo that countries avoided to a subject on which we can all collaborate. There are shared challenges and shared responsibilities. And this exponential growth in migration is reflected in the growth of our own organization, IOM, which has grown from 90 member states at the turn of the century to 151 today, from 2,000 staff to 9,000 staff, from locations in 200 sites to now today 470 sites, and from a budget of $250 million to that of $1.2 billion. This is not leadership on my part or our part. This is simply the growth in the interest of the subject matter as an issue. There's also been a similar growth in regional consultative processes. And I have to say here, that South America, Central America have led the way. The Puebla process brings together Central and North America and the Caribbean. The South American Conference on Migration obviously is for all of South America, and this has spawned other regional consultative processes throughout Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Asia in general, as well as in Europe. These are all playing a vital role in building consensus and confidence on migration challenges, and in a manner that does so without threatening national sovereignty. Because ultimately, we've got to conjugate the paradox that you have national sovereignty on the one hand and individual freedom on the other. And there will always be that tension of how you wed those two in the most responsible, humane, and productive manner possible. That is the equation. That's the magic equation, which I don't have, but we have to keep trying to get it right. So let me then turn quickly in my final part simply to how we bring ourselves together globally under the UN General Assembly's high-level dialogue. This was first held in the year 2006, and we were commenting when Secretary General graciously received us this morning how interest has grown in these past 7 years. There will be a much greater participation this year at the General Assembly in the debate on how migration contributes to development than at the previous high-level dialogue. We're facing a global challenge. The demographics of aging societies mean that increasing levels of migration are going to be required. And in spite of this increased need for migrants, large parts of the world are now turning anti-migrant. Anti-migrant sentiment is widespread. It is a cruelly ironic response to this great era of human mobility. And we have a responsibility to try to question and attack and get rid of the negative and false stereotypes about migrants. What are they? They're coming to take our jobs. They're bringing disease into our country. They probably have a greater criminal element among them than we do, etc. None of these can be proved statistically. It's usually the opposite, that they are probably more motivated, in many cases more talented, and probably better behaved than some of our own nationals. They're not angels, no, but they do have a right, if they are properly welcomed and given an opportunity to integrate into society, they will make their contribution. We have prepared assiduously for the high-level dialogue. I think we have on the desk outside some of the publications we have made. We have been supporting regional groups such as South American Conference on Migration, the Regional Conference on Migration, the Puebla Process, and ECLAC in their deliberations on the high-level dialogue. We have just compiled and synthesized a 400-page book that brings together the contributions of 28 UN and other agencies, what they're doing in the field of migration, how they view migration, and there's a remarkable consensus among us all as to what needs to happen now. This has been published, it's outside. But we held the first international diaspora ministerial conference in June in Geneva, bringing together 500 participants, including ministers from 55 countries, to see how we can help diaspora to contribute even more to development in home and host societies. That volume is outside also. With a number of governments and UN agencies over the past year, we have supported 5 roundtables in New York on the subject of migration and development. That volume is outside also. And finally, we have carefully linked this year's flagship publication, the World Migration Report, to the question of migrant well-being and development. So let me quickly look at the 6 areas. I'll just mention them. There won't be time to do more than that. We've proposed 6 areas of action to ensure good development outcomes of the high-level dialogue. The first one is to improve the public perception of migrants. I've just been dealing with that in this question of anti-migrant sentiment. This means moving away from the narrow negative view of migration as an escape from poverty with a negative impact on societies to an acknowledgement of the important role that migrants can play and do play. The second recommendation is to try to integrate migration more integrally into development planning at all levels, local, national, regional, and global, to try to do this in a manner that it's put into our poverty reduction strategy papers, the United Nations Development Assistance Frameworks. So if we can make this connection, it will move us beyond the simplistic discussion of remittances and brain drain. We have conducted in this regard comprehensive country migration profiles for more than 40 countries, a dozen of these in this hemisphere, and more than 60 diaspora surveys as prerequisites for integrating migration into development planning and for keeping migrants' well-being in mind. The third recommendation, one I think of great interest to you, is to do more to protect the human rights of all migrants, irrespective of their legal status in the country. We have to realize that they are all people who require our very best thinking. So in accordance with the mandate that we've received, IOM directly protects human rights. We also support governments to protect those rights. We're trying to encourage governments to look at their migration policy from what we call a high road perspective as opposed to the low road. What would that be? It's a number of things. It means encouraging governments to give multiple entry visas, to look at the prospect of dual citizenship, to decriminalize those without proper papers. They're not criminals. They need help. Give them an opportunity to obtain proper status. Use our own voluntary return program as an alternative to deportation, which should always be a last resort. Offer integration as an option for migrants. Make your Social Security benefits portable so that if you earn your money in one country, you can take it back home. Give migrants access to health services, educational services, and other public services. We're not doing migrants a favor when we give them access to health facilities. We're acting in our own interest because healthy migrants make healthy communities. Unhealthy migrants spread disease. Have a multi-skilled policy, not one just focused on high skills, and look at circular migration. There are others, of course, a whole of society's approach in which a whole of government coordinating mechanisms bring civil society into the discussion on migrants. A fourth recommendation is to manage migrant in crisis situations, including the implications of humanitarian crises. Now, IOM and UNHCR, traditional partners, we received a lot of public applause for the work that we did together in Libya by returning 229,000 migrant workers to 54 countries at a cost of about $125 million, using more than 1,000 charter flights and very difficult negotiations with the remains of the Gaddafi regime, with NATO and the opposition. Not an easy negotiation. But we did the job halfway. Why did I say that? 177,000 of these we dropped off in West Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. We basically brought you home and basically said, welcome back, best of luck, and we left. That is not doing the job. There was no capacity to receive them in the schools, in the clinics and hospitals. There was no way for them to sort of get life started again. So we're learning from this, and we have to do better the next time in crisis situations. We have to be prepared for the longer term in a much more comprehensive and holistic approach. In Haiti, all of us tried hard. We worked hard at it. At the same time, we were trying to get people in who'd lost their homes into tent cities. Trafficking in persons and smuggling was going on right before our eyes. So we have to do it better. So we've got to look at how we deal with migrants in crisis in a way to be more helpful to them. The fifth point, sorry, that was the fifth, sorry, the sixth one is to how do we enhance evidence building and knowledge-based policy making? How do we raise the quality of our research and our data collection on migration? How can we invest in more fruitful research and data collection? The challenge is to bring this into migration and development policy more evidence-based, knowledge-based. Let me then close by leaving you with one thought based on what I said at the beginning, that large-scale migration is inevitable given what we know about the demographic differences between North and South and the other drivers of large-scale movement, as I mentioned. It is also necessary if jobs are to be filled, skills are to be found, and economies are to flourish. And it is highly desirable if we have the right policies, keeping in mind that migration historically has been overwhelmingly positive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Swing, for this very informative presentation. As you can see from the very abbreviated resume that we shared with you, if someone has the experience and is capable to comment on this issue, is Dr. Martin. And we are very honored and pleased that we have her here. And please, can you use the floor?
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Secretary General and the staff of the OAS for inviting me, and of course to Ambassador Swing for his very exciting presentation and also very comprehensive one. I sort of wonder what's left for me to say after all of those points were made. But I agree with him that this is a very exciting time to be working on international migration, as well, of course, as internal movements of people. And particularly exciting to be working on it in this hemisphere, given the trends that are taking place within North America, South America, and the Caribbean. In addition to the high-level dialogue, which will be taking place in New York at the end of this week, we're seeing a number of trends in immigration that I think pose both new challenges but also a lot of new opportunities. As Ambassador Swing mentioned, we're seeing shifts in the pattern of movement worldwide, and especially, I think, in this hemisphere, in which we're seeing not only continued movements northward to the U.S., certainly in Canada, but also towards some of the emerging economies, certainly the two BRICS in this hemisphere, Brazil, the one BRIC in this hemisphere, but also to Argentina, to Mexico, and elsewhere within the hemisphere. But many of these countries had been countries of immigration throughout much of their modern history and are returning to being principal destination countries for migrants both within the neighboring countries within their own continent, but also to migrants coming from outside of the region. This presents, as I said, both challenges and opportunities. I'd like to pick up on a number of themes that Ambassador Swing talked about and talk about it in the context of what's happening here. Before I do, though, I want to just mention one other issue that didn't come up previously, but certainly is a context for thinking about migration in the Americas, and that's the prospect for the first time in many, many years of serious immigration reform in the United States. The time has not been as good for immigration reform here since the last time around, which was in 1990, as we're seeing currently, and that will create, again, both new challenges and new opportunities. But I'm going to organize my remarks around 5 points that fit very neatly into Ambassador Swing's 6, and try to focus a bit, again, on this hemisphere. The first are challenges and opportunities for countries of emigration, the countries of origin of migrants in this hemisphere, because they're still quite numerous and will be continuing to see large-scale out-migration, as well as, in many cases, significant levels of return migration into their countries. I think the first challenge for those countries still remains having the economic, social, human development within their own countries that allows people who want to remain at home to be able to do so without having to face very difficult choices between survival, if at all, at home or finding better opportunities outside. We should be striving for a situation where migration, as it's said, is more often by choice and not by necessity. But also, in many of the same ways that Ambassador Swing mentioned, we need to be finding new approaches to be able to embrace the migration that does occur, and particularly embrace the migrants and diaspora members to be able to help to increase the development potential within their countries of origin. That means not only receiving remittances and contributions from the diaspora, but making sure that they have a seat at the table as plans for development are made, since they will be among some of the most important contributors to development. A second set of challenges focus on reducing violence, abuse, exploitation of migrants, also reducing xenophobia and attacks within destination countries. There are too many examples in this hemisphere of migrants taking very dangerous routes to get to where there are better economic opportunities, and in the process facing a great number of abuses along the way, and then finally reaching their destinations and not necessarily faring any better. Changing public opinion is certainly, as Ambassador Swing, a major part of that process, but also ensuring that the rights of migrants include the right to a safe and dignified life. Third is to reinforce the commitment within this hemisphere to asylum, to the protection of refugees, and expanding that protection to others who are facing life-threatening situations, from natural hazards. We certainly saw it with the earthquake in Haiti and recurrent hurricanes in other parts of this hemisphere, but also to human-made disasters, whether they're associated with conflict, with cartel and gang violence, or with industrial accidents. We're about to move into 2014, which will be the 30th anniversary of the Cartagena Agreement Declaration on Refugees, which did expand the definition of refugees in many useful ways, and perhaps that is, we have a time where we can revisit Cartagena and see where the gaps still remain and the ways in which the countries in this hemisphere can strengthen our commitment to provide humanitarian assistance and protection to those facing great challenges. A fourth pertains to the integration of immigrants in destination countries, ensuring that they have the tools that are needed in order to be able to move up the economic ladder to fully integrate into their new homes, and also to be focusing on what is needed for the reintegration of migrants who return to their home countries. Mexico, for example, has not only seen a large increase in the number of returnees from the United States, a variety of different reasons, but has also seen the entry of large numbers of their U.S. citizen children who come to Mexico and need to be integrated into our school systems. Mexico is only one example within this hemisphere in which reintegration is a serious challenge. And then my fifth point, which again dovetails very well with Ambassador Swing's points, is that we have to take seriously the need to build governmental capacity at the municipal, the state, the federal levels in all of our countries to address migration issues, to make sure that we're collecting the data that are necessary to be able to assess how well we're doing, to support research and analysis of that data, and to have a continual mechanism by which we can feed that information back into our policy making as we move forward in addressing what is clearly already a major issue, but will be one of the defining issues of the 21st century. So again, my thanks for being able to make these comments, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Martin, for this very illustrative comments and your presentation. And now I pass the baton to Ms. Sherry Tross to conduct the rest of the session.
Thank you, Ambassador Quiñones. I think all of us have benefited already from listening to two very interesting, important, and powerful presentations. I think Ambassador Swing, Lacey Swing, whom many of us have known over the years and have had the opportunity to listen to him on various occasions, always brings a very fresh and informative perspective to this particular issue. Clearly, when we're talking about migration, this is something for the Americas that's visible. It's an issue of very high importance. It affects us all in all of our countries in the Americas. And so for us, when we had the opportunity to have Ambassador Swing come and join us again here at the OAS and give this presentation, we were particularly excited to hear him. And I could see, looking out at the audience as he was making his presentation, that everybody was very much focused on what he was saying. And the same goes for Dr. Susan Martin, who had the opportunity to comment on Ambassador Lacey Swing's presentation and also share some of her own perspectives. I think there's some things that have jumped out at me during this presentation, and I'm not going to repeat what you said because we all heard them. But clearly we're seeing some very significant trends in terms of international migration. As both of you pointed out, we've seen increasing numbers, whether it's south-south, south-north, now north-south, and north-north. So this is a growing trend that we're seeing. You both talked about the impacts of migration and the public perception sometimes of migration. That tied in also very neatly to another area that you talked about, and that is research, where sometimes the public perception lags a bit in terms of what empirical research is showing, so that there's a bit of dissonance between the public perception and the reality of what's happening. And then we talked about policy formulation and how important that is. So, we're going to open up this discussion for all of us who have questions for Ambassador Lacey Swing and for Dr. Susan Martin. I see in the audience some people I know who are working on migration issues, because we've seen you at various of our events, so we know that there are lots of questions out there. But I think just to get the conversation going, one of the trends you mentioned was that there's much more south-south migration now. and that is being reflected in all of the research that is coming on stream. If you could talk a little bit more about that in terms of what you see as being the factors that are most significant in this new trend that we're seeing in terms of South-South, and how this might be affecting the way that policymakers look at the issue of migration now, given this particular trend, and where you see that going.
Thank you, Shirley.
Thank you.
No, please.
No, please.
Several things. One, I think that South-South migration has been important for a much longer time than the general public has been aware of. It's not a recent phenomenon. For a long time, South-South migration has been probably at least on a par and may now be more important in terms of actual movements than North-South, South-North. But it's also interesting to me that given this phenomenon, of course, I've spent all of my career, as you know, for about 30 of my 40 years in diplomacy in Africa, which is what happened to my Spanish along the way. But the Africans, for example, have taken things much further than many other areas of the world. To a degree, it's true also in this hemisphere. In the ECOWAS territory, for example, there is no visa requirement. President Museveni hosted a conference in Kampala in 2009 that both High Commissioner Guterres and I went to, and they came up with a unique document on dealing and helping people in irregular status and victims of trafficking and smuggling. So their thinking has gone a lot further than you would realize. And I think also the reason the public perception is lagging behind is because we're focused on the stereotype of South-North migration. A good example is Libya. At one point, two of the European Union presidents were actually talking publicly about possibly maybe we should temporarily suspend the Schengen arrangement, which is one of the two manifestations of the will to be one. The other, of course, being the European currency, the euro. And yet, in the end, UNHCR and IOM took 229,000 migrants home, and only 35,000 went north to a then 27-member alliance. So there's a stereotypical problem here, and I think that's why we don't recognize South-South.
Yeah, I would just add to it, I agree totally with Ambassador Swing that this is not a new phenomenon of migration within the South. In fact, if you go back to 1960, the percent of migrants, immigrants in the developing world was almost exactly the same percentage as the percent of those in the developed world. But in the interim, there was a lot of movement from south to north. And that was actually a return to the 19th century pattern, so it was a quite new phenomenon. I think one of the reasons it's getting more attention now, though, is because of the emergence of economies such as Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, India, China, which are shifting the way in which we think about migration in many respects. They're both becoming countries of destination for migrants from poor countries within their regions. Also, the Gulf countries have very, very large proportions of their population and sometimes absolute numbers of migrants. But they're also moving themselves around in interesting ways. So we see Chinese traders, construction workers, others in Africa, in South America, Latin America. And this is just putting a very different face on migration, literally, and also becoming a phenomenon that is so tied to the way in which the economy is developing, the global economy is developing, that we can't ignore it anymore. And we have to really try to understand what this whole phenomenon is all about.
Okay, thank you both. While we have people hopefully going to the microphone, let me throw something else out at you. Both of you talked about integrating migration into development planning strategies and as part of poverty reduction. And I know both of you have advised members of Congress and you've advised the heads of state. What kinds of recommendations would you put forward in terms of policy making for integrating this migration to development strategies?
Shall I start on that? Well, to me, the starting point, as I mentioned in my remarks, is getting migrants and their families at the table. It's not seeing migration as a cash cow for development, which I think too often is the way in which they're seen. They provide resources, but they're to be funding, but not particularly seen or heard in the development discussions. I think their views, their understanding about what the need for development is, what they can bring to the table, has to be very, very clearly enunciated by governments. I think the governments that are opening offices within their own structures to reach out to the diaspora are a step ahead in moving in that direction of starting to have meaningful discussions. And yet they may not necessarily be in the parts of the ministry that are developing the development plans. And so we have a disconnect between what's seen often as a foreign policy connection to the diaspora, embedded in foreign ministries, and then not in the planning ministries, the finance ministries, those that are responsible for the actual development planning. So that's the first thing that I would recommend. Find out what it is that the migrants think needs to be done and how they want to be involved, because then everything else will flow from there.
Ambassador?
No, obviously that is the way to go. I think we've looked back on some of the failed experiments, the Gastarbeiter program of the 60s when I was a student in Europe. Never really worked because people were told basically, look, you're here only temporarily, please don't bother to get involved in our society or learn the language because you're going home, and now you have third generation. So we have to have more intelligent policies. This is why so many people are putting themselves into the hands of traffickers and smugglers, because they don't get a fair chance. This is why we held the Diaspora Ministerial Conference, because it's all about stripping away the various obstacles to human movement, to allow those to get to the jobs that need to be done, to welcome them in a manner that allows them to contribute and gives them the option of actual integration into society. Now, this is going to require a significant change in one's attitude and mindset. And this is where I think it's going to take a lot more courageous political leadership to get there, because it's clearly inevitable that these people are going to be needy. And the terms on which they're accepted will determine how much they can contribute to development. But it's a major start if we can get people to understand that migrants are major enablers of development.
Thank you very much. We have two questions over here. We'll take them both, and then we'll give the panel a chance to respond.
Hi, I have a question, because when you're talking about migrants, it seems as though you're only referring to low-skilled migrants. But what about the more educated migrants? How is their movement from the south to the north a positive factor for development when they are leaving their countries behind and making them experience a brain drain? Wouldn't this only make the disparity between rich and poor countries only worse?
Okay. I'm glad that you asked that question. I was actually referring to the benefits of all migrants, regardless of the skill level. What we have learned in recent years is that what was referred to as brain drain, which is actually a term that was coined in the United Kingdom to talk about their college and university educated who were coming to the U.S. and Canada. So it wasn't with regard to what you probably think of the term pertaining to. But what we've been learning is that there can be very great benefits to both countries from freeing what's often referred to as the circulation of brains. providing opportunities for people to come, learn new skills, establish new connections. Sometimes they'll stay in the destination country and utilize those new connections to get work flows back and forth. In other cases, they may return with a great deal of experience. Now, to me, the biggest problem, though, is when we have brain waste. When wealthy countries admit people with high levels of skills, they leave their countries of origin, but we, in wealthier countries, don't really utilize those skills and don't make connections, allow them to do that type of networking and to flourish in their new societies. So I think that there's a lot we can do to make the situation more effective. I think the one area where there is the greatest concern is with regard to health professionals. But some of the recent research is showing that there are as many nurses and physicians in some developing countries who have remained at home but are not practicing their health profession as those who have moved outside of the country. And that means that there have to be new policies, new programs, new incentives to more effectively utilize the skills of those who are in the health professionals at home, rather than just thinking with regard to brain drain, which frankly is too often an excuse for not having better policies in place.
You've said it very well, Dr. Martin. I'm not sure I can add much to it. I agree with all of that you said. We really are trying to talk about a policy that would allow brain circulation to occur. You cannot keep people at home. They're going to leave. You have to then perhaps examine your own policies as to why they're leaving. When I was ambassador to South Africa, I remember going to do a graduate address at the University of Cape Town Medical School, and the dean at that time, Stuart Saunders, in his speech said, "Congratulations and my commiserations, because 70% of you are going to be leaving on the next flight tomorrow." But we need governments have a responsibility, first of all, to examine their own policies at home, how you can attract people to stay home or get them to come back or to keep contributing. There's a responsibility of governments, I think, to try to remain in touch with their diaspora. For one thing, they may need support from the embassies or consulates abroad, but it's very important that that link be maintained. And I think diaspora will continue to contribute across the board. And I think, Susan, as you said, the worst of all is when you get into a situation of brain waste, which now is coined under the term de-skilling, where you have a medical doctor basically driving a truck. Nothing wrong with truck drivers, just that this person is trained to be a physician. We have to constantly look at that. Obviously, our goal has to be that person, when they do return home, will return with either an enhanced skill, a new skill, or some capital to invest. And then then it comes to your advantage that they left for a while to come back with a greater contribution to make.
Thank you. I will say, picking up on this issue of brain circulation and how countries are actually looking at this in a very serious way. I see sitting in our front row some of our ambassadors here to the OAS, some of whom are actually out front in terms of representing their countries with the diaspora here in the U.S., and I know that there are similar kinds of activities going on in different countries. What I think we're seeing, and we're certainly hearing that from our permanent representatives here to the OAS, is that at the leadership level in our countries here in the Americas, our heads and our ministers are beginning to have something that I think you mentioned, Dr. Martin, much more interministerial dialogue, foreign affairs, planning, and finance, about how do we bring these people in and how do we optimize the benefits that they can contribute, not just simply to the country of residence, but also to the country of origin. And that brings us again to the other issue that the World Bank has now coined this term, global good, education as a global good, which I very much like, because people can contribute in a very significant way, whether they're in point A or point B, because the whole labor market has changed. Now let's take a question from over here.
Thank you.
Could you identify yourself, please? Exactly.
Come again, yeah. My name is Fernando Prieto. I work at the General Secretariat in connection with the Spanish Agency for Cooperation and Development that has been supporting the efforts of the General Secretariat on migration issues since its inception, and it's an ongoing support. From a development perspective, then, would you say that the remittances and the contributions by the skilled returning immigrants are the two main drivers for development in the countries of origin? Is there any other point or main aspect that I'm losing track of? Would you summarize that, remittances and his brain circulation, as the two main points, or am I missing something? Thank you.
Remittances clearly are private financial flows, and it's important that governments not denigrate them because they're private and they can't get their hands on them, because it is feeding people, educating children, taking care of the sick and the elderly, and doing other things that are developmental in character. So one should recognize that, but we should also go beyond remittances, and that's where this link is very important. Social remittances, whereby they can, diaspora continue to contribute at home. And I think so much more can be done in that regard. I did last year at the General Assembly with the President of Guyana. We did an evening with the Guyanese diaspora, and they were very interested to hear from their president what's happening in the country, what are the investment possibilities. So I think maybe I'm missing your point, but it seems to me remittances are extremely important for the families particularly, but it's important for the government to make sure that they keep the contact, to try to keep them contributing at home as well.
Tell people to get up and come.
Yeah, I would just add that I think these networks that migrants do develop are extremely important beyond the remittance flows. For example, there have been some studies of how migration contributed to South Korea's economic development. And one of the things that came out of it was that many Koreans in the U.S. or elsewhere, wherever they were immigrating to, developed business connections with companies in Korea and were able to figure out what were the activities that could be done in Korea versus those in the U.S. and brought quite a lot of business back to Korea. We're seeing that in India today in the IT industry, that some of the Indian computer specialists who came to the United States have now established business linkages with companies back in India, in Bangalore, and those in Silicon Valley, and have been able to develop an entire industry based on those kinds of connections. So I think those soft ties may in fact end up becoming even more important than the financial remittances that get transferred, because they're much more sustainable and can help build and can contribute to economic growth over a much longer period of time.
Ambassador of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and then we'll have Ambassador Maisto after that.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to congratulate you, Ms. Strauss, for hosting such a very informative lecture, and to you, Ambassador Swing and Dr. Martin, for your presentations. I'm the Ambassador of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Celia Prince. I don't know if I heard the question of deportation mentioned. If it was mentioned and I missed it, I do apologize. But my question, well, naturally, to start with, if we have immigration, deportation is a very important connected issue. My question is, what, if anything, is the IOM doing or able to do in terms of assisting countries with their policies that help in having deportation being a more humane exercise? This is one of the problems we have here as the ambassador to the USA. There are many persons from St. Vincent and the Grenadines who are here in the United States. They are being deported, whether they're illegal or they are legal residents but have run afoul of the law. And in many instances, the policies do not allow for humane deportation back to our countries. That is to say, it's short notice. We don't get, in the case of criminal deportees, we don't get their criminal antecedents. And in many instances, their assets are not repatriated, and there is no provision for them to be reintegrated into the society. So if you have some thoughts on that, I'll be very happy to hear them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. These are all very pertinent questions, and this one I just mentioned it very briefly in the remarks I made. Basically, first of all, when IOM was established in 1951, primarily to address the ravages of World War II, our Constitution made it very specific that the International Organization for Migration may not engage in anything that involves forced migration. So we cannot be involved in deportations. And this is why what I was saying earlier was that deportation should be a last resort, and there are alternatives in between. We have a program called AVRR, which means Assisted Voluntary Return and Reintegration. Now, we counsel governments, again, we sort of suggest to them that perhaps they'd like to look at such a program. It is, first of all, people return in dignity. They return without a negative stamp in their passport. They have a small bit of money to get life started again. And they return without the stigma of having been deported. Now, obviously, in case of criminals who are deported, that is another situation that has to be handled much more delicately. But generally speaking, deportations are mostly people who've fallen on hard times or who've failed asylum seekers or otherwise. For example, we can get involved in the country once a person is returned, back on their home soil. We can help them to get started again, but we can't be involved before that point there. And I think the more we can encourage governments to do this, and we're getting a certain amount of traction on this, we average about 35,000 to 40,000 returnees a year like that. We get a lot more requests than we can handle, largely because many of the requests involve forced migration, and we don't do that. But you're good to raise I'm glad you raised the question, because it's a serious one that I think governments could look at. And it's not a lot more expensive to go the route of AVRR, assisted return, than that of deportation.
Okay. Ambassador Maister?
Thank you. John Maister, retired U.S. diplomat. First, congratulations, Ambassador Swing and Dr. Martin, for a very stimulating and informative presentation. A question with regard to development and migration and what individual states can do, and international financial institutions, and even the Organization of American States might be able to do to help in the reintegration, in the movement, in the development business that is involved in everything you had to say. And Dr. Martin, you mentioned both Korea and India, and those are interesting examples. Can you give us, both of you, some examples of what some countries are doing smart to deal with the development migration issue, and perhaps even what some international entities, including the United Nations, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, entities like that, may be doing with regard to this issue of development and diasporas and the flow of remittances back? Thank you.
This focus on migration and development is a relatively new one. And it's been an issue that's come up for a long time, but in my experience in the last 30 years of working in this area, it's only been within the last decade or so that it's really become a serious focus of attention at the government level and at the international level. I think it got a boost at the 2006 high-level dialogue on Migration and Development. There's now a global forum on migration and development that meets annually. It's governments, and then there's a civil society component to it. And so it's actually quite difficult question to answer in saying which are the good practices, because many of them have not been around long enough to know what the long-term ramifications are. Having said that, I think some things are definitely coming out. First, there are governments that are very seriously looking at remittances, diasporas, and migration itself as part of their poverty reduction strategies. They're incorporating it into their thinking about development in a systematic way with proper consultations, and that I think is a quite positive sign. There are others, as I mentioned, that have established offices to have communication with their diasporas to be able to consult on these issues. Countries like Mexico have established particular funds. Mexico, it's called the 3-for-1 program, in which every dollar of diaspora support is matched by federal, state, and local dollars if it's towards a development project within the home communities. There's others that have reached out to diaspora groups that have particular professions, health professions, engineering, things of that sort, and are collaborating sometimes directly, sometimes through IOM or through one of the other international organizations to get those skills back home. They're working with the UN Development Program and IOM on this return of skills, either for temporary or permanent periods of time. They're developing information with regard to the cost of remittances and what are the safe channels, so people don't lose a lot of the value of the remittances in sending it. And increasingly, donors, the OECD countries, are now cognizant of the fact that they need to be supporting some of these efforts to help to build capacity in countries of origin for addressing these development projects. We don't have good evaluations yet of how much bang for the buck we're getting in these areas, but they're quite promising practices that I think other governments are now looking at and adopting.
No, that's the Mexican example is a particularly good one, I think, that others could usefully emulate. The Thai Prime Minister was in Geneva 2 weeks ago, and they announced that Thailand is now giving access to all migrants, irrespective of their status, access to all public services, including health and education. And in a very real sense, migrants' contribution to development is very closely linked to the question of their status and their rights. If they don't have access to their own rights, if their rights aren't being respected, the development will be extremely impacted in a negative way. I think Canada's multicultural policy is a good example of how people can be made to feel at home, and that's also part of getting them involved in development. They actually, I think Canadians generally talk fairly openly, publicly, proudly about being a multicultural country. And there are various models. That happens to be one that seems to work for them. On the refugee side, it's interesting that I find Japan and New Zealand doing some interesting things. Japan asked us about 3 years ago to do a pilot program to bring Myanmar refugees from the northern Thailand refugee camps to Japan, to teach them basic Japanese in the camps first, so they had felt a little at ease when they arrived, and then they went into intensive Japanese language training, and then from there went right into a job. Now that's one way to allow people really to contribute. New Zealand does much the same thing with the Bhutanese and other refugees who come into New Zealand. The quotas are very small, but relative to population, it's quite large. But doing it in a holistic way like that, I think, is helpful. Being more sensitive to the barriers to migrants' contributions to development, I think, may be part of the way to go.
Okay, we're getting down to the closing of our meeting, so we're going to take the final 3 questions. We have one here, one in the front, and then this gentleman. And actually, there was a young lady here that I asked before. So these 4 questions, and then we'll ask both of you to respond to those 4. We'll take the 4 questions together, one after each other, and then the panelists will respond, and then we head to wrap up.
Thank you very much. My name is Victoria Rietig. I'm from the Migration Policy Institute, and I'll make my question a quick one about portability of Social Security benefits. Ambassador Swing, you mentioned portability of Social Security benefits among the 6 action proposals of the IOM. My question is simply what has been the recent thinking within IOM about what the next steps can be from the IOM, but also from other actors to further this aim? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. You mentioned something about the environmental scenario. So I was wondering if there are any general recommendations for policymakers regarding environmental migrants or climate refugees, considering the vulnerability of the term, and how can the state be prepared to receive such flow and avoid illegal immigration?
Actually,
Environmental migrants.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you about the immigration reform in the United States. On the 5th, we're going to have the National Dignity and Respect Day for immigrants. And on the 8th, we're going to have a march on the Washington Mall for this, for calling action for the politicians in order to approve a comprehensive immigration reform. What would be your comments on this possible immigration reform? Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Soy el diputado Mencía Juré de Paraguay. Mi país también experimenta el fenómeno migratorio cada vez con mayor escala. Uno de los ponentes hablaba de la migración femenina y nosotros tenemos una experiencia bastante dolorosa en cuanto a las familias cuyas madres migran en el extranjero. A veces migra mamá, a veces migra también el padre, y los niños quedan en una situación de vulnerabilidad muy importante. Son víctimas de abusos, se rompe el vínculo familiar. Y la pregunta es si esta oficina tiene contemplado alguna evaluación y algún programa que pueda incidir en el mejoramiento de estas condiciones en que se quedan las familias, sobre todo los hijos de los migrantes. Muchas gracias.
Okay, so we have 4 questions. The first having to do with Social Security portability benefits. The second, which looked at the environmental migrants and climate change migrants and how these are going to be addressed. We have a young gentleman who wants to talk about comprehensive immigration reform and some of the activities that will be coming up in about another week with the March on the Mall. And we have a question from Paraguay about how the issue can be addressed when families are torn apart, basically, and how do you deal with this in a humane way? Ambassador? Dr. Martin?
I think the first one was directed at me because I mentioned portable Social Security benefits. Look, when I talked about a high road scenario, I was trying to get the attention of governments that they may be following a low road scenario, which means criminalizing migrants, very strict visa regimes, etc. And I'm trying to suggest there is a kind of a menu or smorgasbord of a dozen or more steps you could pick and choose among. I'm not pushing the idea of, I know that dual citizenship is very controversial, perhaps even here, but these are possibilities that governments could explore to improve the possibility that people coming into their countries would come in on a more equal footing and have a chance to contribute to development. So we will continue to stress this, because when I see people able now to go back, for example, to the Philippines, I see people there setting up businesses. I met a fellow in Tapachula in Mexico who had come up with a boutique hotel with the earnings he'd made. This is development. And so I can't tell you how we'll do about it. We are looking at a number of things. For example, we're now trying to get at the corrupt and criminal recruitment industry in large parts of the world. We'll be launching a major initiative next year to say that we want to have a code of conduct. Like we had the Sullivan Principles for South Africa that helped to get rid of apartheid, we want a code of conduct. Recruitment agencies sign up to it. We'll have to have a very strict and strong compliance mechanism to make sure they comply with the code once it's there. But it's wrong to have people being recruited under false pretenses. To tell a young woman she's going to work for a nice family, she gets there, passport taken away, she goes into a prostitution ring. A young man goes over to think he's going into a construction job, and the first year he spends all of his money paying back through. So these are the kinds of things we can do in a practical way on the social. If we do something similar with that, we'll have to tackle them one by one. But let me hold this. Go ahead.
Okay. Environmental migration. Actually, IOM has done a lot of work in this area in terms of some of the best research that's been done in trying to understand the connections. In my view, there are two areas that are priorities. One is to ensure that adaptation policies that are being developed by governments to address climate change and other environmental problems take migration into account, and it's in two ways. One is what can be done to help people stay in environmentally fragile areas, but the other is seeing migration as an adaptation strategy in and of itself, and how can we help people move in a way that's safe and orderly, dignified, etc. And that leads to the second gap, and that's right now there are no immigration policies in any country that really addresses this issue adequately. We have policies for suspending deportation if people leave because of natural disasters and other factors of that type. But I think this is an area where governments are going to have to be starting to devise mechanisms for determining under what circumstances people either have to get out and be relocated, or if they're already out, should not be returned because their habitat is no longer environmentally safe enough for them to be living. And that's, I think, going to be a big challenge. U.S. immigration reform, I wish I had a crystal ball and I could tell you where things are going to go. I wish I knew whether the government was going to be open tomorrow. For that matter, there are obviously other things on the minds of Congress right now. I think that the showing that there is public support for a comprehensive immigration report is extremely important. Where it goes is, I think, at this point, anyone's guess within this Congress. In terms of the question from the representative of Paraguay, I think there is increasing attention now being given to the fact that there may be people who are seriously harmed by migration, at the same time that there are many benefits of migration, and the group that I think is of most concern is what the impact is on children. And it's the children left behind by parents who have migrated, sometimes get great financial benefits, don't necessarily have good emotional benefits out of that process. But I think increasingly it's the concern also about children who are migrating on their own. We've seen in the U.S. a big increase in the number of unaccompanied separated children who have come across the border in recent months. And the focus on children, I think, has to be much accelerated in terms of trying to come up with new approaches that allow for the benefits of migration to accrue, but adequate protections for this very, very vulnerable set of children.
This issue, thank you very much. These are all very good points. I would simply add that as an advertisement for our Spanish version of the World Migration Report, deals with the question of migrant well-being, and there's a lot in there in terms of some of the unhappiness and dissatisfaction of migrants generally. Yes, they're doing better financially, but do they feel better about themselves? Not necessarily. They haven't been as well accepted, etc. So that would be a good one. The point I think Dr. Martin made about unaccompanied minors is a major issue, particularly in Europe right now, where you have thousands and thousands of children who have no passport, no way of tracing the family. Very, very difficult. I think that we're trying to do more to help families to join. This depends, again, on liberalizing visa policies so families can join there. Circular migration can be a help for a lot of the farm workers in Canada who come from Central America are able to keep the family together because they go just for the harvest season or just for the planting season and come back, get more earnings, but keep the family intact. It's extremely difficult to do. We also need to find a way to tweak the consciences of those who charge enormous transfer costs for remittances, which is terrible, 10-12%, and we should be working to try to reduce those too, to help those poor families. But your question is a very good one. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. Let me invite all of you here in the audience to applaud our very excellent presenters today, Ambassador Lacey Swing and Dr. Susan Martin. As this meeting comes to a close, it is my honor and privilege to thank all of you for joining us here today for this 52nd lecture of the Americas. This particular topic on migration, I think everybody would agree, is not only a visible issue for the Americas, it's an important issue for the Americas. And so for us, when we wanted to address this issue in a public forum, we wanted to have the best present. And so we got Ambassador Lacey Swing and Dr. Susan Martin, and I think they've done an excellent job in terms of presenting the issues. Both presentations, I think, also very much complemented the conceptual framework that Secretary General Insulza laid out at the beginning. And I want to stress that, because as much as migration is an important issue in the Americas, for a long time we did not have here at the OAS, we did not pay any dedicated attention to this issue. And quite frankly, Secretary General Insulza, through his vision, really brought this issue to the forefront of what we're discussing here at the OAS and making it a part of the policy dialogue, a part of the technical programming. And so this has become a program that for us is very important. And many of you would know that over the last couple of years, we have been collaborating with the OECD and the IDB on a study called International Migration in the Americas. We put out 2 of these publications now, and we are working on a 3rd, which I think is also going to be very important. And these analyses that we've been doing have really been using a fact-based approach to migration, but using an integrated development perspective, which both of you talked about in your presentations. And so when you read these studies, you'll see we're looking at things like employment and entrepreneurship. We're looking at the effects on families. We're looking at human well-being. We're looking at the rights of individuals. So we're hoping that when we have the 3rd edition coming out toward the end of this year, that all of you will join us again when we present those findings. We have most of the countries of the Americas now taking part in this study, as well as some countries in Europe. And I think something that our studies have been showing very clearly, which brings us back to something that both presenters talked about, is this lag between public perception and the empirical data. And so for us, having the opportunity to work with researchers, to work with governments, to work with migrants, to work with people in NGOs who are in the field, accessing services, needing services, who have great contacts with the people who are very much involved in this whole area, has given us really a very, well, I don't want to say unique, because the IOM and the Institute are also doing very good work, and we think we're all doing good work together. But it brings a different perspective. I think when we started out, we had a very different idea about how the migration program at the OAS would develop. And it took a couple of years of working with the real people, the ones affected, the policymakers, having the different conversations with individuals in different ministries and services that are working with migrants to get a much more holistic perspective, which I think now informs our work. And over the last few years, what we've seen is that some immigration laws that have been enacted in countries here in the Americas are beginning to provide better protection for migrants' basic rights. More and more we're seeing that. for advancing labor rights protections and facilitating access to healthcare, education, and so on. And there has also been some successful migration regularization in the Americas, which have benefited both migrants, their countries of origin, and the countries of residence, incorporating migrants as real actors in development, major contributors. And this is a shift in perception, because when we began looking at it, some of the things we were getting was, well, migrants looking at it from a national security perspective in terms of the threats to security, in terms of how they take, and not as much about what they give. So it's really become a shift in the evolution of thinking about migration. The growing presence of migration on the agenda of international organizations like this one also marks a shift. And I mentioned at the beginning that really Secretary General Insulza has been the leading voice in pushing this. That's a notable development, because while we've always had IOM and other migration-focused institutions dealing with this issue, many of the other international institutions did not focus on it as much. And as Ambassador Lacey Swing said, the interest, the importance of this issue is of such that everybody now recognizes the need to actually pay attention. And not just to pay attention, to pay dedicated attention and to work together. What we have here on the stage this morning is also reflective of that, because we're having two separate institutions. We have an academic institution at Georgetown University, and we have IOM, that's an International Organization for Migration, and the OIS. This underscores that there's also a recognition that there needs to be more cooperation and more collaboration, because the issues of common interest, the issues of common challenge, and the issues of common responsibility. And working together, we really can move in a much stronger way towards the objectives that we've identified. Later this week, as both of our presenters mentioned, the UN is having the high-level dialogue on migration and development, and I'm pleased to say that the chair of the OIS Committee on Migration Matters is going to be taking part in that high-level dialogue, which aims to identify concrete measures to strengthen coherence and cooperation at all levels. The mobilization of action, some might think, well, we're just saying that we're doing this, but no. It's important because of the complexity of the issue. It's important because the underlying challenges are such that cooperation is necessary, it's needed. And the fact that we're beginning to work together in a much more cohesive and coherent way is a reflection of that. So, again, my thanks to both presenters, Ambassador Lacey Swing, Dr. Susan Martin, to all of you, and to the Secretary General for bringing us here today for this 52nd lecture series of the Americas, which I think has been a resounding success. And I invite all of you to join us to continue the conversation informally at a reception downstairs in the Patio Azteca. Thanks again.